While the figure known to us now as Maid Marian has been associated with the outlaw hero of Robin Hood since at least the 1500s, she also has an interesting and rather complicated legacy of her own that not only predates her association with Robin Hood, but can also be linked back to different literary and historical sources, some of which predate the earliest known indications of Robin Hood stories. Welcome to the Greenwood. I'm your host, Thaddeus Papke, and this is the podcast where we peek under the hood of the most famous outlaw who may have never been. From archers to archaeologists, we interview subject matter experts to learn why the figure of Robin Hood continues to endure and consider what we can learn by examining what is known as the matter of the Greenwood. As a figure associated with Robin Hood, and as a compelling legendary figure in her own right, it's high time that Maid Marian gets her due. And I'm not alone in thinking this. Over the past several years, there have been a noticeable uptick in novels, plays, and even movies that center around the figure of Maid Marian. You can listen to episode 18 of the podcast, where I interviewed Bill Thomas and Sophie Craig, the director and star of the film The Adventures of Maid Marian, or episode 25, where I spoke to Teresa Tomlinson, author of the Forest Wife series of novels, or episode 26, where one of the guests was Adam Simkowitz, the playwright behind Marian, or The True Tale of Robin Hood, to get just a sampling of the recent Marian-centric projects being put out there. But I can also recommend the novel Maid Marian by Elsa Watson, and the short novel, also titled Maid Marian, by Thomas Love Peacock, that was published way back in the year 1820. And over 100 years before that, in the 17th century, Samuel Smithson wrote a ballad that foregrounds Marian as the central character. The appeal of this figure, with or without Robin Hood present, has always been evident if one scratches even the smallest amount beneath the surface. The good people of Nottingham have agreed that it was time for Maid Marian to get more representation in their city. And so, on July 17th, 2026, following a period of public engagement surveys and workshops, the city unveiled a new sculpture presenting an abstracted representation of the figure of Marian in a newly constructed green space in the midst of a road named in her honor. Joining me to discuss both this new sculpture and a related temporary exhibit at the Backlit Gallery in the City of Nottingham is Suzanne Golden, the co-director of Backlit. So string your bow, and perhaps consider the public art around your area as we enter the Greenwood with gallery director Suzanne Golden. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm really glad we are able to make this work. I've been really excited about this project for a while, and it's got me eager to go back to Nottingham and see it. I really wish that I could be there during the run of the exhibition itself, the Our Marian exhibit. Oh, let's just go ahead and start with an introduction to who you are and your role with Backlit Gallery, and then we can get into the exhibition and the new sculpture.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks very much for having me. So I'm also really pleased to have this opportunity to talk about the show and the work. My name is Suzanne Golden. I'm co-director at Backlit. Backlit is an artist-led gallery and studio space that is based here in Nottingham, central Nottingham. We've been in operation for sort of 15 to 18 years. We currently occupy a Victorian textile building, 4 floors, which we thankfully purchased from Nottingham City Council January 25. So we're in the process of doing some quite big capital refurbs. We have nearly 100 studio members that are on site that have artist studio spaces, and we have a few galleries on site as well. So we have a regular exhibition and event program throughout the year. And yeah, we're a small team. There's only 6 of us. We're all part-time. We do really quite an ambitious program for the level of capacity that we have, to be fair. But yeah, some really exciting stuff we managed to get stuck into.
Yeah, so how did you get involved with this Maid Marian project?
It's an interesting sort of story. It was to do with the regeneration of Maid Marian Way, a conversation of which we were not part of initially, but the council had received funding from central government to change the roundabout system to a sort of cross junction, if you like. And part of the funding was to make it sort of more pedestrian friendly, to make it a space of which it could be sort of more enjoyed and community could sort of sit and, enjoy the space. So it was an area that they were quite keen to sort of explore the options of public realm and how that would work within that area. The conversation came about with us because the council haven't really worked this way before. So they certainly haven't worked with us for a public art commission. So this was quite a new venture for them. So we've pretty much worked with the transport team, and the culture team have been sort of the side group, of course, that have been alongside that. But our liaising has mainly been with the transportation group. But yeah, so it came about because it was an opportunity for them to do more of a have more of a social engaged approach. So rather than a sort of, pick and stick type artwork of where they could just, lift off a page and then sort of, ferry that in, it was more the idea of working with artists of whom maybe could sort of understand the area, have more of a knowledge of, what the community wanted and why they wanted it, and also to work with us as a gallery to sort of be able to connect with those communities and those artists locally. So it's been a really good opportunity for Backlit to sort of be able to sort of extend that conversation.
And so for any listeners who have been to Nottingham, you'll almost certainly be familiar with Maid Marian Way. It's one of the most famous roads in the city. For anybody who does not know the town, it's a very large multi-lane road that can be found right in between the city center and where the castle sits, the Castle Rock, which is also where the Robin Hood statue is. So it's if you ever go to Nottingham for a bit of Robin Hood tourism, you will definitely end up crossing Maid Marian Way probably multiple times.
The interesting thing with Maid Marian Way as well is that the conversation with the council initially was that it was apparently voted like one of the ugliest roads in the country. And it was just this real sort of sadness to think that because the road has been named after Maid Marian, and then it's then labelled as this sort of ugly or eyesore, you're sort of going, gosh, that's not a great legacy, is it?
Yeah, and hopefully this project will really change that. There's going to be this big rain garden right at the kind of intersection with, what is it, Upper Parliament Street and Maid Marian Way?
Yeah, so it's essentially at the cross junction. They've created sort of more of a sort of irrigated like green foliage system that will encompass those sort of areas of the cross junction. And the rain garden is an area of where, that they really, really want to encourage more sort of growing around the city. And there's a consideration here in terms of those that may know Nottingham of Broadmarsh Square that's recently been sort of reinvented, if you like, into more of a green space and the sort of more of the greening of the city. So it's great to know that that was a really integral part of the change of the road system, to incorporate those elements of greenery.
And right in the center of this new large green space, there's going to be this brand new sculpture of Maid Marian, kind of Maid Marian inspired, because it's not going to be what one imagines as a traditional sculpture that just looks like a regular human figure wearing a dress or something, but it is still very evocative of Maid Marian. I love the sculpture design, and I'll certainly post some pictures of it online. Would you like to describe the sculpture and when it will be unveiled?
Yeah, so the sculpture has been produced by an artist called Alicia Biella, and the nature of the work is it's it's sort of like a life-size outline of a woman made of sort of native foliage from Nottingham, which in itself, that description is doesn't necessarily quite, it's quite hard to describe.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that we were quite keen, not, and it will stand on a boulder as well, so therefore it will be raised a little higher than life size. But the idea of maybe not working purposefully with the outline or, you know, the frame of a woman, or thinking of a is the idea of the notion of who Maid Marian is, or the sort of narrative that surrounds her. Is there's an element of allowing that level of interpretation, because
Yeah.
Maid Marian can therefore, you know, in a lot of ways, there often is the story of that, you know, the tale of Maid Marian is adjusted and adapted in terms of suiting the sort of different environment or territory. And, you know, so it was quite important to allow that element of flexibility or freedom within it, so that it almost it's retained as a collaborative piece, so that, you know, it's purposefully hollow.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea with that is that, you know, well, we were talking a lot around, you know, sort of today's tourism and the idea of people taking selfies and thinking of like different interactions with the sculpture, and the idea of people being able to stand behind it where the hollow work is, so then you're almost encompassed by the frame of Maid Marian. And yeah, so there was a different sort of process in terms of how we wanted to go about it, because there isn't necessarily a replica. There's no sort of typical mold, if you like, of who Maid Marian was. So I think there's something in it of where you can then allow you can then allow whoever you want that to be to become within that frame.
I think that's absolutely brilliant. I love that as a way for interpreting a public art around this legendary figure, letting people put into it to fill it with their own interpretation of the figure, and then using as the frame the native plant still ties it to that area. Is it like oak and hawthorn and bluebell? And so that also brings in that Queen of the May historical association that Maid Marian has. So it still is really acknowledging her historical and legendary roots while still letting people put their own desires and interpretations into this figure. I think it's a brilliant design, and I love it.
Yeah, well, also the collaboration, you know, the collaboration of the piece with the local community started quite early on. So
yeah, there was a whole survey. I remember kind of sharing that out on social media when I first saw it.
And there was some really interesting responses, you know, where people felt, you know, that it's really interesting, because a lot of people often refer to her as like Robin Hood's lover, and, you know, there's often this, you know, this association of Robin Hood, and, you know, and that's understood. And then, you know, there's a, you know, really interesting thought process as to actually to allow her that moment of her sort of own time in the spotlight to sort of celebrate her alone, aside from her being, because a lot of people were saying, oh, you should put her next to Robin Hood. And we were sort of going, oh, well, actually, no, because we think it's a real opportunity for her to have her moment. And the idea of the regeneration of that space, and again, this idea of the regeneration of using plants and the environmental aspect of it, you know, all of those things became sort of really important to the process. But yeah, the collaborative process started quite early on with the survey, and a lot of those survey comments, they then directly fed into the artist brief. So as a result of that, we were clear in terms of, you know, that it gave us like a real roundabout view in terms of what people's interests were, and what people's views were of Maid Marian, and what people's thoughts of generally were of public art. And that fed into the artist brief, which was then, you know, sent forward to Alicia as part of the process. So the idea is that the community consultation at that stage was that community were directly involved in terms of what the piece of work should be. And then later down the line, as in fact, as soon as it was just in May earlier this year, but Alicia did a residency here at Backlit, and we did a series of workshops, quite intense workshops, because there was a lot of them over the period of a week. Really great social engaged practice. There was lots of people came along, Sutherland House, SEN school that's located around the corner, St. Joseph's Primary School, the Women's Centre, Blue Coat, Aspley Academy, a couple of green ambassadors came along, and we also worked with lots of general public. So we had near like 150 people came through the week. And part of the participation during those workshops were they were invited to bring native foliage. And we had like vats of wax that were based in the basement. And part of the workshop was that they were invited to dip the wax and basically coat the foliage within wax. So therefore it sealed it. Throughout the week, we collected over 700 of the waxed branches and leaves and plants. And quite a large proportion of those then went with Alicia to the Castle Foundry in Liverpool, and they have been cast in bronze. And then therefore those bronze pieces are the jigsaw that makes up the actual sculpture. So the idea behind it is that the collaborative process, other than people feeding into the artist's brief, is that they have actually directly informed and produced the end product. So,
that's wonderful. I love that.
Yeah, for us that was, so outside of that being then a permanent piece of which people can take their photograph with and be in the frame, the idea is that it's very much, the roots of it are very much about it being a community collaborative project.
And that's really I think a crucial element to include. I do a lot of work with museums in the UK and the US, and one of the key themes that we keep finding again and again is that importance of community involvement, and that this isn't just like a person's vision, that this is a community collaborative project. I think speaks volumes of your connections to the project, connections to the community, and what it will mean to the people there in Nottinghamshire.
Well, it's ownership as well. I think, the idea of it then being a permanent piece of, if people have contributed that, there's more to celebrate, the idea of, there's been a number of children of whom the teachers have been in touch with me to say that the children are really excited to know as to when the piece is going to be up and running so that they can come and see the work with their family. And the idea of sort of maybe planting some of those seeds, especially with the younger people, and then that being a permanent piece of sculpture that's going to be there forever. The idea that they've contributed to that and they've been part of that history in the city is really important. And also some of the wax pieces that haven't been included within the actual sculpture, they're going to be displayed in the exhibition here at Backlit as part of Our Marian. And the opening for that is Friday the 17th of July, between 6 and 8 p.m. So anybody's welcome to come along. And it will then be open from Saturday the 18th of July to the 8th of August. And we're open Friday, Saturday, Sunday between 12 and 4. So the exhibition here is, well, there's lots of things, but it's certainly... we also worked with a group. Another part of the collaboration is we have an arts and feminist group at Backlit called Lumina. And Lumina have worked sort of within their own project, sort of in parallel to Alicia. So they've been based here at Backlit working away. And they've done a project based around medieval women and medieval headdresses. That was funded by UK SBF, and as a part of that, each of those local artists have been paid a commission to produce a new piece of artwork that will be displayed in the exhibition alongside Alicia's artwork and the wax pieces. So again, there's an extended collaborative opportunity there for some of our local creatives, and so lots of elements to it.
Yeah, so I'm going to adjust my release schedule a little bit to make sure this episode goes out before August 8th, so that there will at least be some chance, hopefully at least a week after it goes out, for people who might not know about the exhibit and can be in the Nottinghamshire area to go to the Backlit Gallery and check out the Our Marian exhibit before August 8th. And when is the unveiling of the sculpture?
Yeah, so the unveiling of the sculpture will be on the Friday, the 17th of July, and
Oh,
it,
okay. That's
it will be available for viewing from 2 p.m.
so that's coming very soon. Yeah.
Yeah, very soon, yeah.
Obviously, this survey and the community feedback, as you mentioned, went into Alicia's brief for the creation of the sculpture. Were there any other historical or legendary sources that also went into that brief?
Well, within the brief itself, we looked at the heritage, the local history of the area. So we did look at the wider scope of that particular area of Nottingham, and therefore the relationship also with the castle, and so the importance of like heritage and history sitting alongside the importance of commentary from local people was a really important aspect to it, alongside sort of other research, certainly that we undertook. Interestingly, there was an exhibition at the British Library about medieval women that happened a couple of years ago now, but there's been a variety of different events and conversations we've had throughout the period leading up to it, certainly with different spaces like the castle and other spaces around. So yeah, so I think there's a constant, there's been a constant sort of flow in terms of people's views on Maid Marian, and therefore how that would feed into the general project.
Mm-hmm. Are there any that really jumped out to you in particular, and kind of spoke to you as people's interpretation of Marian through history?
I think the Matilda Fitzwalter is the one that stood out to me the most, and that was the story of which the idea of Maid Marian, and it not necessarily being I don't know, the sort of outline of maybe one specific woman, it maybe being a culmination of lots of different medieval women from that particular period. And I know with Matilda Fitzwalter that she was somebody that was very much picked up upon in terms of her having one of the closest relationships in terms of maybe being modelled on that Maid Marian. And there was lots of interesting sort of stories that sat within that in terms of her as a noblewoman, and the idea of her rebellion, and the idea of her, we were even talking about the relationship of areas that relate to class in medieval eras, and thinking of gender, and certainly clothing, and that's where the headdresses came up. But the idea that Matilda would dress as she would dress as a boy, if you like, to be gender specific, and then would sort of go and work in the woods, and so there was this idea of placement, and therefore the notion of the requirements of women in that particular era. So yeah, that story in particular did really feed into a lot of the narrative.
Yeah, then there's a lot to dig into there in terms of the historicity of a figure like Matilda Fitzwalter, but also the adaptation into legend, as you mentioned, the class and the gender roles, and the going from courtly life and going into forest outlaw life. And and obviously various writers and filmmakers and playwrights have picked up on different elements of this through the ages.
Hello, listeners. Thaddeus here to provide a little bit of extra context around the figure of Matilda Fitzwalter. Matilda was a real person who lived during the reign of King John in the early 13th century. Unfortunately, we don't know many details about her life, at least not those that can be factually verified. And in that ambiguity, as so often happens, legends began to grow. What we do know is that she was the daughter of Robert Fitzwalter, the Baron of Little Dunmow in Essex. Baron Fitzwalter was one of the leading figures in the rebellions against King John and a key figure in the establishment of the Magna Carta in 1215. Amongst the many grievances that Baron Fitzwalter had with King John was that, reportedly, the king had attempted to seduce his daughter Matilda and was rebuffed by both her and her father. Multiple legends began to accrue around Matilda Fitzwalter, and it became a common belief that King John imprisoned Matilda in the White Tower as punishment for spurning him, and then had her poisoned. There is an effigy at the Priory Church in Little Dunmow that is ascribed to her, and her tragic death has become part of the local lore. But the legend of the virtuous Matilda, who rejected the licentious king, did not just stay local to Essex. By the late 1500s, there were poems and plays being written about Matilda of Little Dunmow. And in 1598, Anthony Munday wrote a play, the full title of which is The Downfall of Robert, Earl of Huntington, afterwards called Robin Hood, with his love to chaste Matilda, the Lord Fitzwalter's daughter, afterwards his fair Maid Marian. There was also a second play, with the full title of The Death of Robin Hood, with the lamentable tragedy of chaste Matilda, his fair Maid Marian, poisoned at Dunmow by King John. As you might guess from these titles, the plays aren't exactly rollicking action-adventure tales. In these plays, Munday conflated the quasi-historical figure of Matilda Fitzwalter with the figure of Maid Marian from the May Day games that was being associated with Robin Hood. In these works, Marian is the name that Matilda adopts when she leaves courtly life behind to join Robin in the forest. Modern writers will still often use the figure of Matilda Fitzwalter as a sort of template when creating their own adaptations of Maid Marian. But now, back to the interview.
So if somebody were to go to the Our Marian exhibit, or sometime later just come to see the sculpture, what would you hope that they would take away? What is the message that you hope they would leave with?
Yeah, I think it's one of the things actually that really fed into the project as well, which is certainly a little bit of a takeaway and hopefully is the legacy, is there is a real emphasis on Robin Hood and the tourism of Robin Hood for Nottingham, which is wonderful and great. But therefore I do feel like there has been a real opportunity missed with there being a lack of focus there on Maid Marian, and a lot of schools that we spoke to, and again being a bit gender specific, but a lot of schools that we spoke to, they did talk about the lack of engagement maybe from younger women and girls, because they were less sort of they were less sort of interested maybe in the Robin Hood tale and the bravado of the sort of role that he took on board, and therefore the idea of then having a different sort of iconic figure that's that's quite a focal point in the city sort of gives a little bit of a different angle to that level of tourism in terms of that that sort of gender role, if you like, and the idea of that the woman, Maid Marian has her own place of which she stood, and and she proudly stands, and she's within like a green space, and she's got her own, she's celebrated within her own right. And I don't know, there's a real element of empowerment and strength and resilience, and and I think that's very true of the character that was built around her. And I'd like to think that is a takeaway. I think also So hopefully quite inspirational for younger people from that respect. And, and maybe it might allow younger people to ask those questions in terms of who she was and what she stood for. And therefore, younger people might find that of interest and might choose to want to know more about them. So yes, so certainly that angle. I think also the angle of the May Queen and the focus on the environmental and the idea of which she's been made out of native plants local to this area. And hopefully, because one thing certainly I did during that period of working with Alicia, and I continue to do now, is that actually taking note of like little weeds or little plants that grow between the paving slabs and sort of actually take more time to sort of look and spend time with nature. And that, I know that's like a little bit of a cliche, but it did really make me think a little bit differently about how nature really sort of fights against urban cities. And like, and I did sort of think there's something that's quite interesting about how Marian has just sort of burst out the ground, and there's this sort of like great figure that sort of stands amongst us. So there's something about the environmental side of things there that hopefully people take note of, and as well.
Yeah, I think so, and I think it is well poised for that, with the bronze casting of the local plants being there in the rain garden, but also in the center of the town like that. Yeah, I can really imagine that having a strong statement in that sort of capacity.
Yeah.
And I think Marian's a sort of perfect figure for that, a figure that kind of is thought to have entered the Robin Hood legendarium through the tradition of the May Day games and plays, and the idea of there being a May Queen. That seems like the perfect interpretation there. And if somebody wants a Robin Hood sculpture, there's the classic one near the castle, not far away. If one wants to have an emphasis on the romance between Robin and Marian, there's a sculpture of the two of them in Edwinstowe. So that element, and as you say, Robin Hood in general is much better represented than Marian herself. And I think we're at a point in time in the 21st century where there is a lot of thirst and interest in Marian as her own figure, Marian as a star of books and films, where Robin is not present or has a minor role. They can still be connected, but she also gets to be a figure that can exist as her own figure as well.
Yeah. And I think, it's often interesting as to what the story of Marian truly is. And I know speaking earlier about the combination of many different medieval women during that period, but certainly in the castle, Nottingham Castle, there's very little to no reference of her there. And there's this really interesting idea of she didn't really exist, and that it was this add-on later down the line, and then which sort of brings back this notion of that a lot of women's history is potentially erased or rewritten, and even that story of the idea of sort of making her stand there sort of true to form, to sort of say, no, I did have my moment in history. There were women like me. And, there's something, again, really important with that. I feel there's, it's a real statement.
Well, and even if she wasn't in the very earliest Robin Hood stories, she's been in them for a whole lot longer than she wasn't in them.
Yeah. True. Yeah.
we have over 500 years of connection with Marian and Robin.
Yeah, that's true.
So this project is sort of part of a wider commitment and recognition to the fact that women in general are underrepresented in the UK, but really probably around the world, if we're being honest. Underrepresented in public sculpture. Underrepresented in lots of ways, but public sculpture in a particular focused sort of way. Who are some other figures, whether it's from fiction, legend, or history, that you would love to see get represented in public sculpture, whether it's specific to Nottingham or the UK in general?
Yeah. Thinking about maybe who that could be, I think, a thought would be is, we've done a lot of work here at Backlit in terms of the history of our building, and it being a Victorian textile building, of which was set up by Samuel Morley in the sort of, I think it was 1810. I forget the dates. That's not great. But there was some really interesting history that we've unearthed about the building here and how it was a factory during that era. And one thing that we've often been interested in is any sort of the focus is very much on Samuel and his life, maybe rather than any of the women that he worked with. And one woman that I'm often particularly interested in is somebody called Emma Cons, who was an artist, social reformer and suffragette. And following the death of Samuel Morley in 1886, he endowed a sum of money to her to fund the adult education college, Morley College. And she was very supportive of penny lectures and working class people. And even though she's not Nottingham based, I do think there's something that's very celebratory about her and the relationship with the building here. And Emma Collins, is a really interesting one. Another one I thought was Julian of Norwich. And, Julian of Norwich is such an incredible character. We actually do have a piece of work that will be in our exhibition, Our Marian, by Dominic Golden. And she's done this animation of Julian of Norwich, which is incredible, a contemporary animation. But a statue of Julian of Norwich would be wonderful. But I think it's also the idea of representation in the same way that the Maid Marian sculpture is being created. I don't feel like it always necessarily has to be factual. I think people can find a meaning and relatable understanding with things on many different levels. So I think interpretation, I don't know, I know this isn't suitable to everyone, but I think like abstract natures or semi-abstract works often allow you to find your own relationship with things rather than it being like for like. And I think in particular, that's something that I am keen on with the Maid Marian, because it is an interpretation and it's representative of a number of women in the past, present and future.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's an important, it should be an array of people rather than a set of individuals. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's fantastic, and some really interesting choices. So I think sound like they'd be really great candidates for public sculpture and just kind of broader public awareness.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think if anything, it just, in the way that hopefully the Maid Marian sculpture will do, like I was saying, it will hopefully allow people to want to dig a little deeper, or certainly find out a bit more about the statue or the city or the relationship with the city, or, hopefully that's what it enables people to do.
Yeah. And I would love to start seeing photos on social media of people there at the sculpture trying to get themselves outlined by its framework and posting those around.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to hearing more about the public response to it. But speaking of the public response, though, just out of curiosity, was there anything from the survey, from the public engagement that you did preparing for the project that kind of surprised you?
I think overall, it just felt like really the general feedback from the survey was people were generally quite positive about the opportunity of this being realised. And not that that's a surprise, but I think often, we found overall, there's sort of like a positive view on it. People are quite encouraging of it, and they feel like this is the right time and there's the right momentum in order to sort of work towards this celebratory moment for Maid Marian. And again, like, not that that's a surprise, but it's very welcome, rather than it feeling, no doubt people will have their various opinions, but on the whole, it's felt quite positive and supportive. And as a process to be involved in, certainly when, speaking to most artists, certainly artists here at Backlit, the idea of delving into medieval art and medieval women, and that as a subject, it's certainly a key topic of subject for many artists on site here. So it's been a real interest point for a lot of people. So perhaps maybe less of a shock, but it's more that that's been very welcome as part of the process, because it's been good meeting new people to be able to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. That's really great. I'm so glad that was done. I'm so glad that that's been such a big part of the process. So I usually end an interview by asking the guest what Robin Hood adaptation is their favorite or that they have the most personal connection to. But in your case, I think I'll ask what Maid Marian adaptation you have the most personal connection to.
Gosh, yeah, there's a lot, isn't there? Well, there's a few. There's not loads. I think for me, it's probably the BBC children's programme, Maid Marian and Her Merry Men.
Yeah.
And there's been many a conversation. There's been almost like a retrospective with a number of friends at the age I'm at, of where we used to watch that as coming home from school, and the idea where that. So there's almost been an interesting looking back at that as a series, and you think, gosh, it was quite a changeable moment in terms of having her as the sort of, the fierce leader amongst the men, and the portrayal of her against, the group of merry men. You sort of think, God, it's like it was a little bit of a switch in dial, wasn't it, in terms of that being put forward as a children's sort of TV program. But yeah, I would say that is the one that rings true and is a sort of fixed sort of childhood memory for me, for sure.
Yeah. Great response. Sort of perfect response given the topic. I certainly found, we did a review of the show last year and certainly found that people who grew up in the UK in the early 90s really have that like ingrained recollection of that show. It's really deeply embedded in there. I had people quoting song lyrics to me all over the place. But it was in the US, it was absolutely not a show that I even had any aware of.
Oh no, okay.
I'd be the perfect age, same like age bracket, but it didn't make its way across the pond.
Oh no.
So I only saw it for the first time last year for the review. But I ended up I enjoyed it. I watched the whole show.
Yeah, I think it was but I don't know when it was definitely that Blackadder era, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So yeah, well, it was clearly Tony Robinson.
We referred to it a lot, yeah, and in large part because of the Tony Robinson connection, but just in general because of the humor and the presentation, it felt like the kids' version of Blackadder.
Yeah, massively. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And yeah, one of the few mainstream adaptations where Maid Marian really does get to shine.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Suzanne, so much for coming to join me in the Greenwood to discuss the Our Marian exhibit and the new Maid Marian sculpture that will be unveiled on Maid Marian Way there in Nottingham.
Yeah.
I hope it all goes swimmingly with the exhibition.
Oh, thanks so much. Thank you for having me.
My thanks again to Suzanne Golden for joining me in the Greenwood to discuss the new Maid Marian inspired sculpture and the gallery exhibit, Our Marian. If you happen to be listening to this episode before August 8th, 2026, you can get to Nottingham, make sure to visit the Backlit Gallery to check out the exhibit. In the episode description, you'll find the link to an FAQ about the sculpture, as well as some links to the Wikipedia pages for Emma Cons and Julian of Norwich. If you've gotten to see the Our Marian exhibit or the new sculpture on Maid Marian Way, then by all means get in touch and let us know what you think. Also get in touch if you want to share your thoughts about your favorite interpretation of Maid Marian, or if you have thoughts about some other women you'd like to see better represented in public art. You can reach out over social media or email. We're on Blue Sky, Threads, Facebook, and Instagram, all with the handle Into Greenwood. There's also a Robin Hood-centric Discord server where we play games, share photos, organize watch parties, and run a book club. We're going medieval with our current selection as we read A Jest of Robin Hood and the other medieval poems that are available. If you'd like an invitation, then just reach out via one of the methods mentioned above and ask. If you are willing and able to help us keep this podcast going, then please consider going to patreon.com/intogreenwood, where you can contribute as little as $1 per month to help keep this podcast on the air. Thank you to all of the stout yeomen, merry bandits, and notorious outlaws that help keep this digital Greenwood available for all. If you'd like to show a little appreciation for all the work that goes into putting these episodes together, but aren't sure about a recurring donation, then you can help keep us well caffeinated for our late night editing sessions by going to buymeacoffee.com/intogreenwood. You can also peruse our fine Robin Hood themed merch at our Dashery shop. There's a link in the episode description, or by searching for Into the Greenwood on tpublic.com. As an independent podcast that is brought to you ad-free, every single purchase or small donation makes a huge difference in our ability to keep this podcast going. And since this whole endeavor was inspired by our guy Robin, Into the Greenwood will always donate a minimum of 10% of all proceeds to charity. For the summer of 2026, our select charity is the World Central Kitchen. Of course, any sort of sharing of episodes, rating and reviewing on your favorite podcast app, and all those sorts of wonderful things is super useful, absolutely free, and really does help others find this show in this algorithm-driven world that we've created for ourselves. Into the Greenwood is produced and edited by me, Thaddeus Papke. No portion of this podcast has been created with the use of generative AI. The theme music for Into the Greenwood is by Plastic 3. That's all for now, though. So once again, I find myself wishing you all safe travels until our next journey together into the Greenwood.